VR Counselor Transition Practices in High-Performing States. This session is being presented by Richard Looking and Ellen Fabian of the University of Maryland. I will now turn it over to Richard Looking.
Thank you, Maynard. Hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here with my colleague, Ellen Fabian from the University of Maryland. Today we'll be talking about one of several studies underway under the auspices of the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center, which is hosted by Transcend Incorporated, along with partners University of Maryland, Mathematica Policy Research, and the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Ellen and I are affiliated with the University of Maryland, and we are conducting a couple of the studies associated with the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center. Our study is of particular relevance at this time because of the recent passage of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. And we have, the reason why it's so opportune is because this new legislation, or relatively new, it's been around for a couple of years now, but it's just starting to be implemented fully throughout the country. The legislation really can be a game changer, and it does two things. If you can turn the next slide, please. It does two things. It promotes the collaboration between vocational rehabilitation agencies and its counselors and schools. And the second thing it does is it actually specifies that money not only can be spent, but should be spent on behalf of eligible youth with disabilities prior to exit from secondary school. Those two things are really critical in this legislation, and particularly the second issue of the pre-employment training services, or excuse me, pre-employment transition services, or otherwise known as PREETs, are a big part of this legislation and a big part of what's available in terms of resources of vocational rehabilitation, time and money for transitioning youth. So, as I said, the use of these new aspects of the legislation really can be a game changer because it does present the opportunity to put youth on the path of successful transition well before they're projected to exit from school. The thing it also does, which is relevant to this current study that we're going to be discussing today, is that it creates new roles for vocational rehabilitation counselors. Now, with these new regulations, counselors are required to be able to not only open cases earlier, but provide specific services to youth at an important time of their transition. So we wanted to know, Ellen and I, as we were researching this, what so far has been effective for counselors in working with transitioning youth, to see how that might impact how we go forward with the preparation of today's and future counselors. And then what do they see as being important to them to learn to be able to effectively serve this youth? And what's the difference between what they think they need to know and their preparation and the perception of how well they're prepared to do those things? And then, of course, all of this in the context of now the current requirements of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. So I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ellen Fabian, who will walk us through the research questions, the specific methodology, and the results we achieved in this study. So, Ellen?
Okay. Thanks, Rich. Glad to be here. As Rich was saying, excuse me, this is one of the first studies that conducted a survey, assessed, explored, I guess we could say, some of the perceptions of vocational rehabilitation counselors and state VR agencies of their transition practices in a post-WIOA context. So we want to make that point that we think that really sets this study apart. So the next slide is the three research questions that basically guided this study. As Rich was saying, we were very interested in exploring the perceptions of voc rehab counselors around transition practices. And we did that through these three questions. How do state voc rehab counselors rate the importance of transition-related activities? Are there differences between counselor perception of importance of skill and their preparation to perform that skill? And finally, what are some of the barriers to implementing effective practices from our respondents? The next slide shows some background of who were our participants. They were counselors from 13 state voc rehab agencies who had the highest successful closure rates for youth. These agencies were asked to participate in the study. I have a citation here for you to take a look at, but basically what we relied on was this honey-cut-and-all study that looked nationally at the successful VR closure outcomes for all youth across a span of years from 2007 through 2011. And from the results of that study, we selected a sample of state VR agencies from whom we would solicit responses from counselors within those agencies. 538 out of a possible 1,690 counselors completed our study. Of those, 70% of the counselors had caseloads that were comprised at least 25% of youth, and 16% of them exclusively served youth with disabilities. So we would call those specialized counselor caseloads. The second slide is just a graphic that gives you a little bit of the differentiation of response rate across each of the state agencies from the counselors within those agencies to our survey. Give you a second to look at that. Okay, and as you can see on the right, those 13 agencies were Alabama, Colorado, Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, Maryland, Minnesota, Missouri, North Dakota, Oregon, Utah, West Virginia, and Wyoming. So we'll give you a second again, and the size of the slice of the pie in that graph represents the proportionate number of counselors that we had from that state VR agency. Okay, next slide. Talk a little bit about the instrument. We called it the VR Transition Practices Scale. It was derived and adapted from some of our colleagues' work. Tony Plotner, some of you may be aware of, did a couple of, developed a transition scale similar to ours, and we relied on Tony's work as well. The scale consisted of 35 items that respondents rated on a Likert scale. What I want to make the important point of is that of those 35 items, 19 were specifically related to transition practices. So the other items were questions around how large is your caseload, how long are demographic questions, as well as some issues around what was the nature and makeup of your caseload. We also, within that same survey, as I mentioned before, identified some of the, asked respondents to identify some of the major barriers to serving students and youth from a drop-down menu of 12 items. The next slide gives you a little bit more background of our counselor participants. As you can see, the majority were female. The vast majority had at least a master's degree. 45% had the CRC credential. Just a small 58% were rehab counseling degrees. And again, the caseload of at least 25% youth, 70% of our sample. So these were counselors who really had experience in working with transitioning youth. The next slide then describes some of the results. As you might remember, we had 19 items that tapped into transition practices, and we asked our respondents to evaluate on a Likert scale from 1 to 4 the extent to which they felt the practice was important in their work, and then secondarily, the extent to which they felt prepared to perform that practice. So this first slide on results describes what our counselors felt were the most important skills of those 19 transition practices. As you can see, all 19 items were rated at least moderately important, so they were 3.0 out of a 4-point scale. The highest rated item for the most important transition practices was job exploration counseling, rated at 3.8 out of a 4-point scale. And as some of you may know, that is one of the pre-employment transition services. The lowest rated down there at the bottom was collaborating with LEAs, local education agencies, on evaluating post-school outcomes. So that was still high. At 3.0, that's moderately important. But of the 19 practices, that one was rated the lowest. The next slide goes into a little bit more detail on the importance of the 19 items, and what it describes is the 5 highest rated items on importance. So what were the 5 most highly rated transition practices? And you can see these: job exploration counseling, work-based learning experience, partnering with CRPs, conducting career assessments, and providing workplace readiness training. Again, you might want to look at that list and identify that 3 of them are actually pre-employment transition services. Of course, job exploration counseling, work-based learning experiences, and workplace readiness training. The next slide goes on the opposite end, and of those 19 items, describes which were the 5 lowest rating in transition practices. And those you can see for yourself: self-advocacy training, participating in IEP meetings, participating in person-centered planning, involving employers in the transition process, and finally, the lowest rated item, collaborating with LEAs on summary of performance or post-school outcome indicators. So one of these, providing self-advocacy training, is a pre-employment transition service, and although some of the others aren't, such as involving employers in transition, as Rich was saying at the beginning of our presentation, that's a very important underlying theme of WIOA, is the notion of partnerships with employers and facilitating youth employment. The next slide shifts to looking at what are how counselors evaluated their preparation to perform these transition practices. And similarly to the importance, we talk about what was the highest rated and what was the lowest rated of the 19 items. One point I want to make, and perhaps not surprisingly, is that all of the preparation items were rated lower than were the important items in terms of transition practices. The highest rated in terms of how counselors felt they were prepared to perform these transition-related practices was developing an individual plan for employment, or an IPE. And then the lowest rated of those preparation items was involving employers in the transition process. So this kind of goes back again, a theme is developing here about some of the undergirding of WIOA, which was partnering with employers to facilitate long-term positive outcomes for youth with disabilities. The next slide, again, talks about what are the 5 highest rated performance, how prepared am I to perform this activity, and I draw your attention to a couple of these. 2 of them are also pre-employment transition services, providing counseling on PSE, post-secondary employment opportunities. And then just below that, as one of the highest items in terms of performance, is conducting job exploration counseling. So the other highest rated items in terms of preparation to perform were developing an IPE prior to school exit, initiating a VRKs prior to school exit, which is an effective and best practice, as many of you may know, in school-to-work transition, and finally participating in IEP meetings. The next slide still is in the area of performance. So the 5 lowest rated items of transition practices, 2 of those, the first 2 are pre-employment transition, arranging for paid work experiences and providing self-advocacy training. And then you could see that the others are also important, essential, some of them, to implementation of WIOA, collaborating with workforce development centers. And again, we have that important one right at the bottom there, involving employers in the transition process. So just to reiterate, these were the 5 lowest rated transition practices that these counselors felt prepared to perform. Finally, the last slide on our results where we talk about the 19 transition practices, we called items with the largest or most significant gaps. And these were the items that were the gap between the perception of the importance of the transition practice and the person's preparation to perform it was the largest. So even if the item was rated a little bit lower on importance, if the gap between importance and preparation was large, we included it in this results slide. So as you can see, these 5, again, another one that keeps showing up on a lot of these slides, particularly around preparation, is involving employers in the transition process. Another where the gap was the highest, largest between importance and perception, providing work-based learning experiences, providing workplace readiness training, collaborating with workforce centers, and securing paid employment prior to school exit. So it kind of starts, there's another theme here that is apparent or increasingly apparent that speaks to those opportunities for offering youth or securing for youth employment or work-based experiences prior to school exit. And we'll see that and come back to it again toward the end of our presentation when we go into some of the implications and recommendations. However, one thing to note in this slide is that those places where the gap is the largest probably are good places to think that may be where the training need is the strongest. Okay, for the next few slides, I'm going to turn it back to my colleague Rich to talk about some of the barriers.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. And I think that was a really important way to lay out the difference between what counselors think are important and what they think they're prepared to do. And remember, these were counselors who were responding from states who had the highest successful closure rates for transitioning youth. So there's some reason to believe that these were counselors from states, and therefore maybe the counselors themselves had a relatively high degree of effectiveness, already identifying that maybe they could be more effective if they knew more about the areas they thought that were important. So just to reiterate Ellen's point about the training. The third question we asked, after we asked what do you think are important and what do you think you're least prepared to do, we asked what are some barriers to effective practice, because their perception of barriers will also have implications for how they approach their caseload and how they are prepared to do their work. So I'm going to give you a list of maybe 5 or 6 or 7 frequently cited barriers, and then later in this presentation we'll talk in more detail about the implications of this. But among the most frequently cited were time and case management. In other words, they said that we have more people we're serving than we have time to serve as effectively or as thoroughly as we'd like. A common refrain, I think, from VR counselors in the field that other studies have pointed out. And this has implications also for how case management is coordinated at the district level for individual field counselors. But anyway, that was one of the top barriers cited. Lack of transportation, also a long-standing barrier that has been cited by many studies and anecdotally by many rehabilitation counselors in the field, that the ability to get an individual from their home to a job is often a barrier to effective service. They also talked, another barrier was lack of viable employment options in the area. And now we weren't able to discern who was responding from a urban area versus a rural area, but regardless of that, this did pop up in a frequently cited as a frequently cited barrier. So in other words, even though they're ready to prepare their people in their caseload for work, there may or may not be job options that are viable for them in the areas where they live. So But to make a finer point, if you go to the next slide, the counselors who had specialized caseloads, remember that Ellen said earlier that a relatively large percentage of the counselors who responded to the survey had over 70% of their caseload were students and youth. In other words, they had a highly concentrated caseload of students and youth. So well, might they have a different perspective on some of these barriers? And the answer to that would be yes. In fact, the barriers, they perceive fewer barriers in certain categories that I think are pretty important to point out. So counselors with specialized caseload perceive fewer barriers in 4 categories. First of all, the severity of disability. So another way to say that would be that they perceived the individuals they worked with as they were more likely to presume them employable or less likely to see barriers in having them achieve successful employment than other counselors might. And one might presume various reasons why this is, but again, more familiarity with these individuals, more concentrated work with these individuals, the less they see severity of disability as a barrier to employment. They were also less likely to see the lack of LEA, or local education agency, and service provider collaboration. And it's pretty easy, I think, to see why this would be, because if their caseload is specialized, it's more likely that they're going to be spending time and collaborating with representatives from the LEAs and from the service provider community, who might all be working together to serve, to work with commonly served students and youth. So they were less likely to see that as a barrier. They were also less likely to see need for additional training, which again suggests that they felt pretty equipped to do their work, or relatively speaking, when they're working with transitioning youth. And one might presume that this is because of their greater exposure to working with these youth, and so they felt more equipped to do so. And they also, this is significant also because of the last one, difficulty engaging youth in VR services, because one of the long-standing challenges in VR nationally has been to enroll youth in VR services and keep them engaged so they follow through on their rehabilitation plans. The counselors who had specialized caseloads were less likely to see this as a problem. Now, again, one might presume that this is because their familiarity with the group makes it easier for them to identify ways in which to engage the youth. It also suggests that as they're collaborating with schools and with service providers, they're working with greater resources to make services happening for these youth, and they're able to identify jointly with their partners how to approach and engage youth who have been eligible for and have agreed to receive services, and who will then follow through with the services they're eligible for. So, next slide, please. So there are several conclusions and implications we can draw from this. As we already said, counselors perceived all of the transition-related practices at least moderately important to their success with the transitioning youth population. And by the way, toward the end of our discussion here today, we will give you link you to a resource that can give you the full version of the survey we used, so you can see what all of those 19 transition-related items were. But anyway, as we already said, they perceived all of them at least moderately important. So there was none of them that they said we shouldn't do this, or shouldn't be able to do this, or shouldn't know how to do this. But there were gaps that existed between what they perceived to be important and what they thought their preparation to engage in those activities were. And notably, these were related to employment. So another way to say this would be that if our work, or I should say the work of vocational rehabilitation counselors and those partnering with counselors, is to promote and develop the opportunity for youth to engage in employment, then of course that should be at the top of the list of skills that they have. And it's still interesting to note that even though that's the main objective of the VR service, there's still perceived gaps in their ability to perform and engage in those kinds of activities that will lead to that employment, particularly engagement with employers, and particularly producing and promoting work-based learning experiences, which are essential to WIOA pre-employment transition services. Is one of the 5 key categories, of course, is work-based learning. And so what we're hearing and seeing here from the survey is that they think it's important, but they're not ready and they don't think themselves skilled enough to be able to make these happen as much as they should. This has very big implications for how counselors receive training, both before and during their service as rehabilitation counselors, which we'll talk about more later. This is also interesting. The last another conclusion that we can draw here is that counselors who have a higher caseload of youth, in other words, specialized caseloads, had a higher perception of preparation. Now, this may sound logical because they're doing more of this work with more of these youth, and so they're more familiar with doing it. But another implication might be how are counselors' caseload assignments determined, and might it be useful to consider identifying and creating more specialized caseload assignments so that they're more successful with these youth and they perceive themselves as being capable of helping these youth achieve more successful employment outcomes. So the next slide. So here are the implications. Again, this will be another way of saying some of the things we have already said, but the implications are, I think, fairly straightforward and pretty easy to discern from the surveys that we conducted. And I want to reiterate again that the surveys really captured a pretty large percentage of the counselors who would have been available to respond to the survey. So 500 and some out of 1,600 and some is well over 1/3 of the possible respondents who responded to the survey, which suggests that we got a pretty good sample of their perspectives. And the other thing is that, remember, these were counselors from states who have been identified as having a higher proportion of successful transition youth in their state services data. So again, relatively successful counselors and counselors, and we got a pretty good sample of those counselors. So this is perception from counselors who one might presume are pretty good at what they do and pretty knowledgeable about how they do it. So again, the feedback we're getting from the survey has pretty important implications for what this might mean for practice and further both research and practice. So among the implications are for the need for improving VR counselor capacity regarding employment-related services. So if, again, one of the key pre-employment training transition services is a work-based learning experience, securing paid employment is a training need, an obvious one. And if they're going to perform these work-based learning experiences in the workplaces of employers, they're going to have to learn how to engage employers, which is the second item on this implication list. And then third, coordinating with American job centers or the workforce system, because again, by virtue of the WIOA legislation, American job centers or workforce centers are obligated to work directly with employers and engage employers, and this might be a resource that might augment some of the typical voc rehab counselor activity. Counselors are saying we think it's important to deliver work-based learning, but we're not so sure we have the ability to do it as well as we'd like. And so, again, a major implication for their preparation. So the next slide. So this suggests a further need for improving VR counselor capacity regarding employment-related services. I just mentioned those. So we can go to the next slide.
Right.
Now, Helen, I'll let you talk about the limitations, and then I'll jump in at the end about some of the resources and some further implications about some of the research going forward. So, Ellen, you can talk about
some of the limitations of our study. As Rich was saying, 538 out of 1,690 is a pretty good response rate, somewhere up around 38%. However, it still is an estimate since we do not know the number of VR counselors in the specific agencies with transitioning youth on their caseload. So in other words, we sent an invitation to participate with the permission of the state VR agency directors to all of the VR counselors within that particular state agency, but we had no way of knowing. Presumably, many of those counselors, perhaps half of them, we just don't know, did not have any transitioning youth on their caseloads at all. The second is that you have to take into account our sample may be biased, as those counselors most motivated and or knowledgeable, maybe those who responded to the survey. It seems that we had pretty good variation in our responses, but as you'll remember, for example, most of our transition practice items were related moderately to high, above 3.0 on a 4-point scale. So that may be an indicator that perhaps there was a little bit of self-selection bias in our sample. And then finally, and this is reiterate something that Rich was saying, of course, our survey of 19 items, and we will direct you to the brief that captures and that describes each of the 19 items that deal with transition practices, did not nearly tap into all VR transition practices. As Rich set the stage at the beginning of our presentation, we were most interested in those practices that were either directly pre-employment transition service practices or that were consistent with or aligned with some of the themes and some of the focus of the WIOA. So now I'll turn it back to you, Rich, to talk about recommendations and future research. So the next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. And one more comment on the limitations. Even though a limitation was that the sample may be biased by counselors who are motivated and or knowledgeable, there's something to be said for getting information from those who are the most motivated and most involved. And so I think from that perspective, that limitation may be almost an advantage as well. In fact, many other kinds of research, focus group research, for example, uses feedback from people who are very successful at what they do as a way of getting feedback about what works and what doesn't work. So I would count that limitation as a very minor one, but it is one because we didn't get it from everybody. So we have we generate a lot more questions than we are able to answer here. So we think that it's important in future research to do some other things. And one of the things that other other studies have pointed out regarding transitioning students and youth is that one of the most, if not the most robust predictor of post-school employment success for youth with disabilities is whether or not they had work-based experiences while they were still in secondary schools. And so that prediction is even more robust in the case where they've had paid work experience while they were in secondary schools. So since that's the case, we need a more complete understanding of what are the perceived challenges of counselors who are putting together and authorizing services for pre-ETs to students. We also need a more complete understanding of caseload specifications. The fact that counselors with highly specialized caseloads of transitioning students and youth had perceived themselves as being more prepared suggests, as I mentioned earlier, that caseload assignments and caseload management might be dictated or might be influenced by the idea of specialized caseloads having some relatively important influence on counselor success with students. And the other thing we need to research further is specific categories of pre-ETs by counselors and their effectiveness. And I think we have a question from somebody about that very thing.
That is correct. The question is, does this study have implications for VR counselors' use of one of the other pre-ETS categories?
Yes, okay, that's a very good question because counselors at their discretion can often authorize one or more of these categories. As we saw earlier in this presentation, counselors saw among the most important skills they needed was job exploration counseling and work-based experience development. So already successful counselors are saying how important those things are. And so of the categories of pre-eds, one might presume that based on our feedback from these counselors, those two categories are at the top, should be at the top of the list. The other thing I would say is that in addition to this study, there are so many other studies that we, Ellen and I, and our colleagues and other colleagues around the country have researched this. Since work-based experiences is such a robust predictor of post-school employment, one, I think, can almost say that of the 5 pre-eds categories, that's the one that counselors should really focus on. And because this is going to yield better outcomes for the students, and it's going to yield for vocational rehabilitation more successful rehabilitation closures. So that's one thing that we think is important, but we can't definitively say that's the only one without more research. But if I were to ask what's the most important now, I would say concentrate pre-ed funding on work-based learning experiences almost exclusively. But again, we need to do more research on that. So. Go ahead, Ellen. Is there another question?
Is there another question?
Yes, we have a number of questions. The following question is, do you know of any place VR counselors or any others can get additional training and transition?
Oh, yes. That's a very good question as well. Under the auspices of our RRTC on vocational rehabilitation in youth, we at the University of Maryland offer a 12-credit academic certificate program, and it is called Career Planning and Placement for Youth in Transition. It's all online. It's taught by faculty like Rich Lukine and myself and other people who are experts in transition-related practices. We begin a cohort every fall, so right now we're starting one up in the fall of 2018. I encourage you to Google it. Look at the University of Maryland website, and it is called Career Planning and Placement for Youth in Transition. If you have any follow-up questions on that, I believe that our contact information is included at the end of this presentation. So we will we will be able. Let me know, and I'll be happy to get back to you on that.
The next question, are you following up on this study and how?
Yes, excellent question. Thanks for asking that. Well, as we indicated, there's lots of other questions we have. So what we're doing now, we're in the midst, as we speak, of engaging another round of questions for interested counselors. So the same states, from the same states that we interviewed for this survey, we went back to the state directors and asked, could we have permission to talk to these counselors further? 6 states gave us permission to do that. And so we have actually concluded the surveys of counselors from each of those 6 states, a handful from each state, and to get more information about their views on these very issues. And Ellen, I think you can probably give us some more specific information about that.
Yes, as Rich was saying, that's phase 2 of this study under the RRTC, and those are telephone interviews. And in these interviews, we really focused on implementation of WIOA with specific focus on pre-ed. So what are VR counselors doing? What's it like in their state? What barriers? What best practices? What strategies? We are in the midst of getting that study ready, and hopefully we'll be able to present that at an upcoming webinar.
Yes, and we want to make sure that I guess the next phase is really pre-ed focused in our questions of these counselors. So now we want to put these kinds of issues in the exact context of pre-eds and their delivery. So I think that'll have some important implications, much more refined implications than the ones we were able to achieve from this study.
Okay. The next question, do you have any information on related follow-up studies?
Well, of course, the one we just said, we have that. We also conducted a study that was also conducted under the auspices of this RRTC on vocational rehabilitation in youth. And that study looked at the implementation of a model transition service that was implemented in the state of Maryland in 11 distinct school districts. It featured an intervention that included early VR case initiation, and this is well before the WIOA was passed when we started that project. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because we just published a study on that, and we compared youth who participated in that demonstration, and these youth received early VR initiation. The cases were open 2 years before they exited school. They had work experience. There was collaboration between VR and the schools. All that was featured as part of the intervention. And we compared the VR outcomes of those youth who participated in that demonstration with youth who did not in the same counties. And what we found basically was that the youth who received the intervention that heavily leaned on early case initiation and work experience were more likely to be employed at school exit, were more likely to have a successful rehabilitation case closure, and were also more likely to be employed later, well after their case was closed. We did find that here's the other important thing we found was that it cost less to serve them, which has tremendous implications for all of this we're talking about today, because if cases are open early before they exit school and students have an opportunity for work-based experiences before they exit school with the help of VR, then it's not going to cost as much money because the collaboration basically allows for the sharing of resources between the LEAs and local rehab and the service providers. So that's a very significant finding of that study. And we'll give you a website link to where you can find this study and the one I just mentioned and get a little bit more information about both of them. But that's another study that has similar implications. Also, it feeds right into the why WIOA is a game changer in transition, because early VR case initiation is mandated under WIOA, and work-based learning experience is one of the pre-eds, and again, that predicts more successful outcome. And for VR, if you can get more successful outcomes at less cost for more students, what's not to like? We just need to identify ways of training counselors to be able to do these things and work collaboratively with their partners to make these things happen.
And those are the questions that we have so far.
Okay, great, very good. So just a couple things in conclusion. The slide here that you see are the references that we cited earlier in our talk. The first reference is the study about the differences in vocational rehabilitation experiences of transition-age youth. This is where we were able to glean those 13 states that had the highest case closure. So that told us where to go to conduct a survey. The second two references were counselor efficacy scales, which we were able to borrow heavily from in developing our own scale. Our scale is different from theirs, but it does borrow from some of their methodology, and I think it helped us in putting it together. And one thing I should say about our scale, by the way, is that not only did we base it on already tested scales, but we also ran it by experts before we tried it out to get their input, so that we had the input of current experts. So, and the next slide, and we promised more information, so here it is. That website is the website of the RRTC on VR practices in youth. So the website is vrpracticesandyouth.org. If you click on that site, you can click on studies, and then VR practices, and then center publications. And you can read a brief summary of the presentation the research that Ellen and I just presented. Also, the study that I just mentioned about studying the 11 districts in Maryland. There's a summary brief on that website of that as well. So if you don't want to dig into the academics of all this and the dense research that it takes to do this, you can get a summary at those websites and get basically the implications of what we've done. The study we just presented is in press. It will appear in the Rehabilitation Research Policy and Education Journal sometime this year. And it's written by Ellen and I and a colleague of ours at the University of Maryland, Deborah Newbert. And so when that's available, you can get into the details of what we presented today. And if you are a hardcore researcher, you can dig into the methodology. If you're a VR practitioner, you can read the implications and get we think, something important from that. But again, the brief summary of this and the other study I mentioned are both available on the website, easy to download and read. They're more than 4 pages at the most, each of them. And I think with that, we conclude. There are no more questions, I assume?
That's correct.
Okay. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope our presentation was helpful, and just want to, as we sign off here, encourage you to go to the website that you've been given for more information. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you. At this point, I would like to thank Richard Looking and Ellen Fabian, both of the University of Maryland, for presenting today's session, VR Counseling Transition Practices in High-Performing States. Moving on to the next slide, I would like to remind you all to visit our website at vrpracticesandyouth.org. The website highlights our research findings, publications, related products, tools, and other resources, providing up-to-date evidence-based information with the ultimate objective of enhancing VR service delivery to accomplish the long-term goal of improving the lives of transitioning youth with disabilities and their families. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions and sign up to join our mailing list on our website's homepage. Moving on to the next slide. For those of you who will be requesting a certificate of participation, the code for this session is VR Practices and Youth. Again, that is VR Practices and Youth. That is the code for those who will be requesting certificate of participations. You can reference the email that was sent to you with the login information for this webinar session for further information on requesting a certificate of participation. At this point, I would like to thank you all for participating in today's webinar session, the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on VR Practices in Youth welcomes you for participating on today's webinar session. Should you have any questions, feel free to contact us at 301-424-2002. You can email us at rrtc@transcend.org. And again, you can visit us online at vrpracticesandyouth.org. Thank you, and have a good day.